Hello. This class is called The Colonists' Common Heritage, and in it we will talk about the ways in which the types of people who arrived at the new colonies affected American government. It is often said that everyone in America came from somewhere else. This is entirely true on some level, although obviously different people arrived at different times. It's important to realize that everyone came from somewhere else, especially that the people who had the influence in colonial government came very early on from somewhere else. This led to them having several different things in common. For example, because all of the people who were working on the Constitution and before that the Declaration of Independence had probably within the last 2 generations come from overseas, it meant that they were probably more likely to be independent, courageous, and so on. After all, you had to be very courageous to think about getting on a rickety sailboat and traveling for months to come to the colonies. Once they were here, these people had an increased incentive to, quote-unquote, make it, because they quite honestly had very little else to fall back on. If you think about it, people who are coming to a colony don't have a big social support network, can't rely on families and relatives and great uncles who have money if they can't make it on their own. One of the interesting things about the people who came to the colonies is that often they were people who had trouble fitting in or making their own way at home. Thus, for example, people who were the second sons of wealthy landowners were more likely to come to the colonies because the way the English land system worked, the first son inherited everything, and the second son inherited pretty much nothing. In addition, people who had conflicts under the existing government often came over. Many of you know the story about the Pilgrims who came over in part because they felt that they were being persecuted for their religious beliefs in England. The fact that these people who were in the colonies began by being sort of not fitting in very well at home led them to believe that they should have a lot more say in the system that they created. They had a reason to want a greater say because, for example, if you think about the Massachusetts Bay Colony founded by the Puritans, the majority of people who were in the Massachusetts Bay Colonies were Puritans. Therefore, while they were a minority in England, they were the majority in their colony. It's important to realize that this did not mean that one of the greatest sources of conflict in the old country was abolished. The class system, which tended to believe that people of upper classes should govern and people of lower classes should not, was not immediately abolished, and there's considerable effort that even after the Declaration of Independence, the class system still held. But it did mean that people had more opportunity and more desire to move up. The class structure in the colonies was less rigid and had greater opportunity. After all, there was far more land in the colonies, and so people had a greater opportunity to purchase it than they would have in England or anywhere else in Europe. At the same time, however, many of the colonies were founded with an understanding that at least the people who founded those colonies were on some level equal. For example, Pilgrims coming off of the Mayflower made sure to sign a document called the Mayflower Compact before they got off the ship. And this included an indication that everyone was equal, regardless of whether they were Puritans or whether they were simply people who had basically put themselves into servitude to get across the ocean and have a chance. All of these people then came to something that was considered by them to be uncivilized land. They did this partially by design. The Massachusetts Bay Colony especially was meant to be isolated and away from the influence of other people. The Puritans wanted to be by themselves. This meant that they had the opportunity to start from scratch in building their own types of governments. And because colonies were formed by different groups of people, each of whom had a charter to form a colony in a particular place, governments in each of the colonies, which subsequently became the states, had slightly different arrangements. Some colonies were very religious but completely free, like Massachusetts Bay. Maryland, in contrast, was also completely free but founded by Catholics, which would lead to potential conflicts with the Puritans in Massachusetts. There were also government plantations in Virginia, which were set out with a profit motive. And it's important to realize that early on, there were already colonies of other governments. The Dutch, for example, had settled in what is now New York and New Jersey. Much of what this meant, however, was that how much territory, which territory you were in, depended on who you were.